So I got involved with decentralized identity and privacy after I finished my PhD. I worked for what's called the World Wide Web Consortium at MIT. It's the web standards body for Web 1.0, not Web 3.0, where I worked for the inventor of the web on standards. And I noticed that there was no good identity work on the web. There was a bunch of not so working stuff. And there was no cryptography inside of web browsers. And furthermore, it was very hard to maintain user privacy in front of all these cookies that were being thrown at users. So I tried to fix that for a few years. I led the web crypto standardization effort where we standardized crypto APIs and JavaScript around, 2000, I guess, 13 through 16 with Google and Microsoft and Mozilla and everyone. And that worked. But the fact of the matter is, even just using cryptography, we couldn't really get user privacy sorted out. So that's why I left W3C. That plus they started backing DRM. Yeah. So what happened is we founded a startup after I left the W3C called NIM, and NIM makes two things. It makes a mixnet and a credential system. Why are you going to make two different things? Because the way you want to think about it is that privacy is the holistic property of an entire system. So it's like if you have, every time I send, for example, call someone on Zoom, I send bytes across the internet. And those bytes, the timing and volume of those bytes, serve as a kind of digital fingerprint, right? And that digital fingerprint effectively identifies me. So what a mixnet does is, like, if you pretended each of those bytes was like a deck of cards, was a card in a deck of cards, it kind of mixes those cards up, it shuffles those cards and sends them out. And that basically prevents anyone who's watching the internet to figure out who's talking to who. So that's very important because a lot of governments spy on the internet. So as we know, for example, from Snowden, that the NSA has the ability to passively watch almost every internet packet. And even when if you're a foreign diplomat overseas, your internet connection is probably being watched by whatever country you're in or whatever telephone company you're using. And that's pretty dangerous. So the mixnet is the only technology we know that can prevent that. Tor and VPNs just don't really still leave you that fingerprint. And then we built NIM Credentials, which is a privacy enhanced identity system, which basically lets you prove using zero knowledge, that you're over 18, that you're an authorized diplomat, so forth and so on. And so it lets you prove things about yourself without revealing more than necessary. So that's kind of like imagine a kind of magical driver's license or identity card, which whenever you showed it to, for example, to go into a bar, it would just show that you're above, in the United States, 21, or if you wanted to vote, it would show that you're a citizen of the country, but it would show nothing else. And it could prove that mathematically. That's kind of cool. So, human dignity is related a lot to freedom. If you don't have freedom to talk to each other, if you believe you're being watched, like you're being surveilled, you will act differently. There's been a lot of psychological studies on this, but it's just true. So, for example, under the former USSR or under Nazi Germany or in many countries which had dictatorships, there's always kind of a secret police tapping everyone, and then people act differently. They act afraid. They might not say their real political beliefs or their real personal beliefs. And so the mixnet and the credential system lets you express yourself and use freedom of speech without worrying about being surveilled. So people can act more authentically, and we think that expands dignity. And the credentials are especially important because there's a lot of people like W3C DIDs, which are pushing for global identity systems. Now, we think any global identity system attaches a unique identifier to a human is pretty dangerous. As they said in this TV show, The Prisoner, I'm not a number, I'm a human being. And so we also think that the credential system expands human dignity as well. For example, let's say you have an unpopular opinion about, for example, I don't know, a government that's having hyperinflation, like the government of Lebanon. And you're afraid, if you look at the history of Lebanon, when people speak out against the government, they tend to get assassinated, or their car blows up, or they get killed in a mysterious fashion. So you want a way to publish your beliefs and your opinions about the government of Lebanon without worrying about reprisal. So just as, people could publish anonymously using other tools, but not as much privacy, you imagine that I would, rather than, email or connect to the newspaper, I would send the newspaper my opinion columns, or I would send them anonymously, using the mixnet. And I think that's a pretty great use case. A lot of the early documents that founded even the United States were done by anonymous authors. And we could imagine whistleblowers and all sorts of newspapers and journalists using the mixnet. For the credentials, it just lets you prove that you're a human being of some sort without revealing your identity. So that's very useful in terms of freedom of speech as well. If you want to prove that you have the right to vote, for example, and the right to have an opinion about this election because you're a citizen, you live somewhere, but you don't want to, you're afraid of reprisal. You can prove, oh, for example, I live in Beirut, but I don't need to give away my exact address, which could open me up to danger. Yeah, so obviously, if you're in a group, for example, like a chat group, and you're planning a protest, for example, like we had an Arab Spring in the Middle East, or more recently, even the anti-COVID vax protest in Europe. A lot of these groups are monitored by secret intelligence agencies. The police or some other intelligence security force, or just maybe, could be, let's say you're organizing a protest. You could even have people that just don't like you infiltrate your group and try to attack you. So we used to have this problem a lot with, Nazis inside the United States, and various kinds of fascists. So, you want to make sure your group is secure, and your group, you're not, by using the internet, revealing that you're in a group. And the mixnet would definitely help do this, because you could access the group, you could prove you're part of the group using a credential, but no one could see you access the group itself. And that's very important. We know, for examples from Syria, activists like my good friend Basil Safadi, they were killed because it was proven that they were part of activist groups because there was a backdoor in a program called Skype, which is a Microsoft peer-to-peer program. So they were in prison and tortured, and the evidence against them was mostly from Skype. So peer-to-peer isn't enough. You still need privacy. You still need, in order to use privacy, you need something like a mixnet. So that's a different kind of system than a peer-to-peer system. It can be built on top of peer-to-peer systems, but it's definitely not there by default. And so in order to get freedom of association, you need something like a mixnet working effectively on the bottom. And, freedom of association typically involves groups, and you don't want to be attacked by what we call a Sybil attack, where fake people join the group and overrun it, or spies or someone else. So the credentials allow you to do that. So I think that's a pretty good kind of feeling for how you can imagine groups using the group chat messaging apps using these kinds of technologies. That being said, those technologies aren't built yet, but we do think we're going to build them over the course of this next coming year. Yeah, so a lot of governments are very interested in privacy, but the problem with most governments is they want to spy on their own citizens, and they just don't want to be spied on by other governments. So in order, unless you are the United States or you're a country like China, you don't have your own surveillance system. You essentially have to rent or buy your surveillance system from another country. So, for example, you have to choose. Saudi Arabia chooses to get their surveillance system from the United States. Iran chooses to get their surveillance system from China. They basically buy the software and the blacklist and the whitelist and all of that, and the machine learning tools. And this leads to a form of cyber colonialism, which is very dangerous, where you're essentially dependent on the technologies of other countries, and those countries can surveil you, right? So the United States controls the software of Saudi Arabia and can surveil Saudi Arabia. China controls a lot of the software used by Iran. They know exactly what's going on in China. So they know exactly what's going on in Iran. So what you need some governments have to realize that in order for them to have privacy, everyone has to have privacy, not just governments, not just secret services, not just intelligence agencies, but like every citizen, ordinary citizens need to have privacy. In order for everyone to have privacy, everyone should have access to mixnet, and government systems should encourage, rather than these kind of EID systems or electronic identity systems, they should encourage technology like anonymous credentials. In fact, up until very recently, the European Commission was funding anonymous credentials, and you've even seen their usage in places like the Netherlands to make privacy preserving COVID passports, which is sort of strange, but an interesting use case. So what's happening now is that I think citizens are organizing together with kind of the more progressive, enlightened policymakers, and we're putting amendments for a right to privacy, not just a right to data protection. Data protection just says, hey, I own that data. That's my data. It's for the self-determination data, and therefore I have the right to access it. You have to ask me for consent before giving it. I give it to you. And that leads to a lot of annoying, pop-ups where you have to click yes, I would accept these cookies, or no, I don't, or what kind of cookies I accept. And it's just made the entire experience of web browsing kind of irritating. The cool thing about mixnets and credentials is that they would basically solve these problems, like login with Facebook or cookies, without forcing people to choose. They would just have privacy by default. And then if you wanted to give away information, you could, but you would have a lot of control over that. And these are the kinds of systems that government should be promoting. Now, of course, Silicon Valley isn't promoting them. Google doesn't like them because Google's business model is based on surveillance. Same with Facebook or Amazon or even Twitter. But enlightened governments realize that they're not going to beat the United States or China in the technology game, and they should support these technologies. And they should give their citizens not just a right of data protection, but a right of privacy. Because privacy, my life online is just as much as part of my real life as my life outside here, wherever I happen to be in the physical world. There's not two different worlds. There's one world, and my life extends into the digital realm. And therefore, my fundamental rights should extend into that realm. So what we've been promoting in Switzerland, and which maybe we'll see some progress in Costa Rica, is what we call the right to digital integrity. My COO, Alexis Roussel, has been the primary pusher. But what the right to digital integrity says is that I, as a human, just as I have integrity over my body and my mind, I should have integrity over my data, my privacy. This is part of me. And therefore, I should have the right to privacy and the right not to be surveilled. And we have put that up for, using the kind of democratic Swiss process, up for additions to the Constitution and what's called the cantons, which are like the sort of smaller states of Switzerland, where they have a lot of autonomous power. So in Valais, Geneva, Neuchâtel, even Vaud, I think, all the French-speaking parts of Switzerland, we are now having these kinds of votes on changing the Constitution to amend the right to digital integrity and thus the right to privacy into the Constitution. And we think that's really cool, and we hope it can come to Lugano and Costa Rica and other countries that are pro-privacy. Well, it's like back to what I just said, it's really a new kind of fundamental right. And so we tend to support, rather than changing the existing laws, just making sure the existing laws can be implemented on the internet. And if a new law has to be made, like we have to specifically specify that we have the right not to be surveilled and the right to have privacy, that this law is put in as a constitutional amendment on the federal level. In Switzerland, it was very hard to do on the federal level, so you do it on the state level first, the cantonal level. And you can even imagine it happening on the city level, like with, for example, the city of Lugano's Plan B. So what we're imagining that more and more people will come together to make these amendments, and eventually we can have international laws, like a kind of new kind of digital social contract, which enforce these laws. That these laws go directly, these constitutional amendments for the right to privacy would go directly against the business model of a lot of big companies. But these are a few big companies, mostly in America and a few in China. But honestly, most countries don't get tax revenue from, and they don't get much benefit from. All that happens is their citizens get spied on. So we think that governments should support this, but change tend to come from the bottom up. So people need to support as well by building the technology, using the technology, and pressing upwards in forms of a social movement to get these changes done. And this was called by my old boss, Tim Berners-Lee, what's called a Magna Carta for the web. So what the Magna Carta is the Magna Carta was a kind of first kind of Bill of Rights produced against the king during a revolt in England in the Middle Ages. And so we want people who are now upset at surveillance, tired of having their freedom restricted, who want freedom of speech, freedom of association, who don't want to basically be controlled or manipulated by Silicon Valley. We want these people to revolt and force these new kind of neo-feudal kings of Silicon Valley to help create a new Magna Carta for the web. Well, I mean, my main message would be if I were a policymaker, particularly from a smaller country, I would really support these efforts for privacy. So, a country like Switzerland, their entire economy is based on trust, that people used to trust that the banking system was private. And then the United States came in and forced the banking system to open up, so it's no longer private. That's the same in Lebanon. Lebanon, the banking system was private. It was forced to open. All the Saudis took out their money, and now you have 4,000% inflation. So if you're a small country, particularly with the dollar going up in value and your currency probably having some inflation, you're in trouble. And you're not sitting on top of these companies like Google or Facebook, and you don't have the resources like China to build a great firewall or build your own surveillance apparatus or social credit apparatus. And so I think it's very silly for people to want these things like globally unique identifying ID systems. All this stuff coming from the World Economic Forum is mostly very stupid and dangerous. And instead, we should focus on a bottom-up way to build privacy-enhancing technologies by combining technologists, support from smaller countries, and citizens that are concerned about these topics should come together, because only if we come together can we realistically make it happen. And even NIM, that's how we happen. NIM started out, I left America after being upset at the World Wide Web Consortium. I got to France. I started working for the French government. And, the European Commission was scared that the US government was spying on Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany's cell phone. They were very upset. But they said, look, we don't, a VPN, all the VPNs, even the, Cisco or Juniper, the Microsoft ones in the United States, they have back doors. And even these local VPNs, they can't prevent the NSA from spying on us. So we need something more powerful than a VPN, even more powerful than Tor, which is, of course, US government funded. So the European Commission approached me and my other friends like George Denisis and Claudia Diaz and Aglos Kiayas, who are all now part of NIM on some way or another, to build something like a super VPN for governments that they could actually trust. And we built that, but then we realized that not only do governments need this, everyone needs this. Cryptocurrency companies need this. Ordinary people need it. Human rights activists need it. So that's where the MixNet comes from. And so we hope to continue this effort throughout South America, throughout Africa, the Middle East, all of Asia, and even Europe and the United States eventually. I think the United States maybe will be the last country to adopt these. But if I were an intelligent small country like Switzerland or Costa Rica, I would definitely endorse privacy. That gives me an economic and political edge over competitors. And now there's a lot of people looking for countries that are pro-privacy and pro-freedom to live in. If you look at what happened in El Salvador, even though, they did pay off the IMF loan, that looks like their Bitcoin bet wasn't so bad. And so, Switzerland's making a big bet on privacy with this Trust Valley initiative that we're part of. And we'd like to see other countries make these kind of big bets. And we think that's really the kind of edge and leadership that we think countries should take. And eventually we'll get all this stuff more global, but you got to start small to begin with.